Welcome to English 181, Topics in Genre Studies, Theory of the Novel. Lecture 1, Defining the Novel. Genre. Let's talk a little bit about novels. If you're asked to name some titles of novels that you've liked and read for pleasure, or if you are asked to name some titles of novels that you studied in an English class, it's more than likely a number of titles would instantly come to mind. And that's because novels, I think, are probably the most recognizable literary form that we have. Widespread, very popular, and in some cases, the novel form has reached a very high level of literary art, and some novels have a lot of cultural prestige over others that are, merely popular and sort of last for a number of years and then sort of disappear. But many novels are quite enduring still. Now, ever since major advancements in printing technology and improvements in the design of printing presses, cheaper and more abundant sources of paper, which is the primary material for making books, and rising literacy rates, which is really important, throughout the 18th century in particular, novels and novel reading have proliferated alongside a large body of criticism and interpretation of novels. As we will see, that criticism emerged very early in the story of the novel, at a time when the earliest attempts at the form were starting to appear throughout Great Britain at the opening of the 18th century. In fact, the novel as we know it today is the product, really, of an intense set of debates between prose fiction writers, literary commentators, and those who read both of these kinds of writing. At the outset of our course, then, definitions of key terms matter. Because this seminar is grouped among other classes at the university that explore topics within the field of literary genre, let's begin with a brief review of that term genre. In thinking about the genre of the novel in the context of our seminar on the theory of the novel, it's best to start by establishing some of the main features of its long and complex history. That history contains an enormous variety of examples of novels, so it would be useful to keep in mind that the novel as we understand it is a form of literature that traces its roots back to many different kinds of writing that were not, strictly speaking, novels. Right now, you probably know more about the formal properties of the novel than you think you do. And that's because, as I say, we've become so used to the conventions of reading novels that it allows us to recognize them instantly for what they are. And many of us have even studied the genre of the novel in different periods in other English classes, either here at UCLA or at other institutions of higher education, and indeed in high schools throughout the country. The word genre comes from the French word for kind or type, which derives ultimately from the Latin word genus. Genus, as some of you know, is a word used in the field of biology to classify subgroups within different species of the plant and animal kingdoms. It is used in literary studies, film studies, painting, music, and other fields to distinguish different types of creative work that bear a family resemblance with regard to composition, structure, or subject matter. In literary studies, it is used in two ways. First, in a general sense of distinguishing between large categories such as prose, poetry, and drama. And second, it is used to distinguish between different types of compositions within those groups. For example, under the larger category of works written in poetry, we have specific types like lyric poems, epic poems, sonnets, etc. Under the general category of prose fiction, we can name Gothic novels, science fiction, the short story, etc. The term genre is used loosely. Today we only use it as a convenient way to describe a group of works, but bearing in mind that the formal or technical characteristics that exist among works of the same kind are only relatively uniform, and the boundaries between genres are often fluid. Having said that, you might, if asked, have little trouble naming some actual novels that you know very well, like the Harry Potter series of books you may have read in your younger years, or books like Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, or John Steinbeck's East of Eden, or F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, all of which are what we call canonical works in the tradition of the English and American novel that you may have encountered along the way in your education. Some of you English majors would certainly mention a few of the better-known 19th century novels, such as Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, Charles Dickens' Great Expectations, George Eliot's Middlemarch, Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, and many other titles from this very important period in the English novel's artistic development. In fact, the three 19th century novels that form the foundation of our seminar this quarter are exemplary samples of the form. In addition to Dickens' Great Expectations, we will be reading Jane Austen's Emma, which was published at the beginning of the 19th century, and Henry James's The Portrait of a Lady, which was published near the end of it. In considering its fuller history, however, we have to go somewhat beyond the development of the English novel in particular to consider prose fiction as a worldwide phenomenon, one that evolved gradually out of many different languages, nationalities, and cultures. Early examples of what we now call novels spread, intersected with, and influenced each other for hundreds of years. Its sources are varied and multilingual, often transcending one geographical area or one cultural tradition. Having said that, there are whole national traditions of the novel that we know about that differ in many ways from the tradition we've come to understand by way of our study of the history of the English novel. In approaching any study of the novel, it's impossible to exclude these other traditions. We can think, for instance, of the enormous influence of the Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace and his Anna Karenina, Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, as well as his novels The Idiot and The Brothers Karamazov. Going further back in history, we can see one of the earliest of the great novels in Miguel Cervantes' Don Quixote, a contemporary of William Shakespeare. And in the 19th century French tradition of realism and naturalism, we can name the great series of novels known collectively as the Human Comedy by Honoré de Balzac, and the 20 or so novels that compose Émile Zola's multi-generational epic of one French family called Rougon-Macquart. There is also Gustave Flaubert's masterpiece of realism and narrative control in Madame Bovary, as well as the romantic novels of Alexandre Dumas and those of the Goncourt brothers, to name just a few from that national tradition. Moving beyond the Western European tradition, we also find ancient narrative precursors to the novel throughout Asia and the Arab world, including The 1001 Nights and the classic Chinese epic known in English as The Journey to the West. Making the problem of defining the novel more complicated are all the subgenres that grew out of this literary form over the hundreds of years of its development, including, for example, the Gothic romance, the detective novel, science fiction novels, sentimental novels, Bildungsroman, novels of ideas, novels of protest, historical novels, and so on. While all of these categories of novels speak to the generative power, adaptability, and endurance of this flexible literary form, the sheer abundance of examples like these makes it challenging to pinpoint exactly what makes a novel different from other literary forms like drama, poetry, short stories, novellas, hypertexts, digital literature, or even narrative film. To have a theory of the novel, we must first have in mind a way of identifying the distinctive traits of the genre. So let's begin with the most agreed upon criteria for defining what a novel is. The first general feature is that novels are always written texts made of words that are read as texts by readers. Now, this may seem too obvious to say much about, but it's nevertheless important to keep this in mind over the next 10 weeks. In other classes you may have taken, and in other classes I've taught that include novels on the reading list, the question sometimes arises of substituting actual books with their audio versions. And this has come up as an option for students who may be pressed for time to get their coursework done. And while listening to someone read a great novel can be a wonderful experience in and of itself, it's not sufficient for a serious student of the novel. There are reasons for this. As the novel developed through the 18th and 19th centuries in England, it did so within a growing print culture that had pervaded everyday life. As novelists established their reputations and tried to make a living from the sale of their work, they collaborated with magazine editors, printing houses, and book merchants to create, over time, an audience of readers willing to buy their words. Another way to put this is to say that the novel could not have emerged in the way we understand it without having simultaneously created a certain kind of readership willing to accept and appreciate what this new kind of writing was about. When we read novels instead of listening to them read by others, or watching their film adaptations, we are recreating the conditions that went into the making of the novel as a unique literary form. The earliest novelists and reviewers had, to some degree, explain or frame or even apologize in elaborate ways for what they were offering the reading public. In prefaces that we will read from a number of 18th and 19th century novels, you will see these authors try to work out for themselves what their writing is about, how it should be read, why reading is not harmful, and how fiction is related or not to the reality of people's lives. So these defenses, we might call them, tell us a lot about what early novelists were up against in the competitive market of print, but also something about the concerns that people had about learning and entertainment in the societies in which they lived. This kind of meta-commentary is quite noticeable in the prefaces of early 18th century novels, and it's important to see these as part of the text that any reader would have first encountered in picking up these books. In these early cases, the novelist's address to readers is fairly explicit, but it becomes less so as the form of the novel develops in later years. But even up to our own times, when the conventions and implicit habits of reading novels is so completely internalized and taken for granted, a certain meta-discursive element can still be detected in oblique form in the beginning of many novels, and we'll see this as we go along. There are reasons for this, too, that make reading a text more enriching than listening to one or watching a film version of one. Those are entirely different artistic mediums that operate with their own aesthetic goals and principles. Novels are textual, readerly experience, one in which the reader plays a role in creating the meaning of the novel by way of how authors, narrators, characters, and many other linguistic devices engage with the reading process. In fact, the conditions of the reading process become an essential part of the text we are reading. Those conditions include things like reading silently, for the most part, abstracting oneself from the world around us. The process of reading fiction in particular requires us to give up reality for a time, no matter how realistic the novel appears to be. Readers shift away from their consciousness of their everyday life, replacing it with the consciousness of other people, other worlds, other ideas that we adopt vicariously for the amount of time that we spend reading. Now, although in our own day we take such things for granted, these necessary conditions of reading novels were felt more self-consciously by readers and novelists in the 18th century. And that's because they were rather new to people in the early days of the genre. Reading silently about fictional people who never existed would have seemed peculiar, even dangerous, driving people's imagination in directions that threatened their stability, their reality, and their very sense of self. Novels could stoke fantasies and desires in the reader that they didn't know they had, urge them on to new and false ambitions about the world and what life held for them, even though the actual pursuit of those desires would, in real life, probably lead to disaster. Young women, especially, were thought to be the most susceptible to the fantasies and dangers of novel reading because their guardians thought such books would implant wild ideas of romance, forbidden physical sensation, or encourage moral laxity. For these and other reasons, it's crucial to approach our study of novels as first and foremost texts made of words. In particular, it's important to think about novels as texts that are aware of themselves as texts to such a degree that an astute reader can detect this self-referential aspect weaving its way throughout the novel. This metadiscursive aspect of novels can be found especially in the way they begin. Beginnings of novels are thresholds that negotiate the reader's transition from reality to imagination, from their present consciousness to an arresting and replacement of that familiar everyday consciousness. And as such, whether explicitly or indirectly, novel openings often comment upon, reenact, speculate upon the transitions their readers are making at the moment at which they begin to read the novel. In the famous opening chapter of Jane Eyre, for example, we first encounter the orphaned girl of the title cut off from the world and restricted to the inside of her aunt's home, where she is with her hateful cousins because it is raining outside and she can't take a walk that day. To get away from the cruelty and abuse to which her family is subjecting her, she retreats into reading a book behind a window curtain, immersing herself in a travel narrative and sitting in a physical location that symbolizes, by way of the window, the transparent boundary between the outer world and the inner world of her mind. We, the reader, in a sense, open the novel called Jane Eyre almost at the same time the fictional character of Jane Eyre opens her book in this scene. The symbolic pantomime here is an acknowledgement of the act of reading itself. Another general feature of the novel that comes immediately to mind is also rather obvious, but it's highly significant. Novels are written in prose. Another way to put this is that the language of novels is the language of real life, the way people actually speak. Writing in prose instead of poetry, the novelist aims at conveying reality through language rather than calling attention to language as such, the way poetry often does. Language in poetry is concentrated, tightened into patterns and rhythms, whereas prose fiction organizes itself around different principles of composition and uses different kinds of aesthetic devices and conventions. A plot in a novel may, for instance, have its own symmetry, characters may have their own special functions and arcs of development, scenic and descriptive elements in a novel may be interspersed with dialogue or narrative asides. Of course, practitioners of any literary art care about language use, whether they are novelists, poets, playwrights, or short story writers. We want, therefore, to make fine distinctions between the different ways in which a writer aestheticizes language. But the main point here is that novels use the vernacular to reach a wide audience of readers and to maintain a close connection to everyday reality. There's even an argument to be made that vernacular prose is an anti-aristocratic form of communication and literary art, custom made for a middle-class readership that by and large does not have access to an education in the classical languages like Greek and Latin, like their wealthier counterparts do, and who lack the university training reserved for the aristocracy and upper-class gentlemen of 19th century English society. Of course, all of the descriptive criteria that we're listing here are subject to many exceptions. For instance, having just stated that novels are prose works that use the vernacular language of regular everyday people, we might be tempted to correlate that medium with the subject matter of novels. That is, we think of contemporary realistic novels as about people like us, people we may know, people we have heard about, people we want to be like, people who frighten us, etc. Even back in the 18th century, readers of novels encountered in them people of their own station, with names like theirs, or below their station, whose private histories, as they were sometimes called, seemed very familiar to them. Moll Flanders, the prostitute, Robinson Crusoe, the enterprising castaway, Tom Jones, the lustful young man searching for his true father, Pamela, the virtuous young housemaid being pursued by a rich man who wants to enslave her as a lover, and many others. These are not heroic characters in the classic sense of an Achilles or, say, Sir Lancelot in the King Arthur tales. Later in the 19th and 20th centuries, we get characters who are even socially lower than that, who seem very familiar indeed. Theodore Dreiser's Sister Carrie, the 19-year-old Wisconsin girl who moves to Chicago to earn her own living at the turn of the 20th century. William Dean Howells' Silas Lapham, the paint manufacturer whose morals are compromised by an unethical business transaction. Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, the barely literate, abused son of a violent drunkard who befriends and aids an escaping black slave named Jim. Toni Morrison's Sethe, a former slave who kills her own infant daughter to prevent her from being taken back into slavery by pursuing slave catchers. Willa Cather's Thea Kronberg, the young daughter of a Western immigrant family who has a gift for singing. J.D. Salinger's Holden Caulfield, the disaffected prep school boy from Connecticut. Abraham Cahan's David Levinsky, a Jewish boy trying to establish himself in the big city. Richard Wright's Bigger Thomas, the young black man caught up in the tragic consequences of two politically radicalized white friends in Chicago, and so on. They are all flawed, as we are. They are all very human and very accessible to us. They talk the way we do. And yet the strangest thing about them is that they never actually existed anywhere in reality. This brings us to one of the more fascinating aspects of the novel, and that is its fictionality rather than its factuality. Now, that too may seem like a very obvious kind of distinction to make about novels, but it's not as clear as you might think, and it was one of the largest issues that people debated in the 18th century, the idea of the difference between truth and fiction, for example. The novel, as we know it, cannot be said to be history in the way that we read history. But novels are often framed in such a way that they seem like a series of real events that are happening in a historically specific time period. Some novels actually use real historical events in their fiction, the way, for instance, Charles W. Chestnut does with the 1898 Wilmington, North Carolina race massacre in a book he published in 1901 called The Marrow of Tradition. Also, you might think of the writer Stephen Crane, whose Red Badge of Courage is based on the Civil War, a civil war that Crane did not experience personally, but read about in the Century magazine years after the war had ended. But again, these are fictionalized accounts that raise the fundamental question, what is more true as an account of the Civil War, a history book of the names of generals, of dates, of battles fought, or the imagined experience of a frightened young soldier in that war? What tells us more about the atmosphere of the American 1920s, a study of the economy of that decade, or reading a book like The Great Gatsby? These questions were the same ones that readers, critics, and novelists of the 18th century debated at great length in England. The questions persist when we ask how to categorize a book like Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, which is an account of the random and brutal murder of a Kansas family. Capote went to Kansas after reading about the Clutter murders in the newspaper, interviewing all of the main people involved in the case while it was still fresh. What he produced out of that journalistic work, however, cannot be called journalism per se. Capote arranged his findings into dramatic episodes. The genre of the nonfiction novel emerged as a descriptive category to account for the novelistic elements that Capote used in telling this story. He covered all aspects of the case in the way a novelist might, from exploring the lives of the two murderers and their victims, the crime scene and the community in which it occurred, the trial that followed the apprehension of the suspects, and finally the actual execution by hanging of the two men, which Capote witnessed firsthand. In a book called The Executioner's Song, the novelist Norman Mailer took a similar approach to writing about the case of Gary Gilmore, a drifter who was convicted of murdering a gas station attendant. The point here is that the novel is an expansive literary form that is capable of adapting itself to an almost endless array of subject matter and stylistic approach. In fact, it is so promiscuous in this sense that it may seem impossible to define accurately the form. One theorist of the novel, named Guido Mazzoni, for example, has recently come up with a way to describe the novel. He writes, and I'm quoting, "Starting from a certain date, the novel became the genre in which one can tell absolutely any story in any way whatsoever," end quote. If that sounds overly general, it certainly is, but it is also a conceptual rather than a formalistic starting point for understanding a theory of the novel. Another starting point is a slightly more class-specific way of defining the novel, especially the English and American novels we may be most used to reading. The English theorist Terry Eagleton has defined the novel this way, for example. The novel is the mythology of a civilization fascinated by its own everyday existence, he says. Now, I say class-specific here because one of the most influential studies of the English novel by a scholar named Ian Watt claims that the 18th century novel arose as a popular form at the same time the merchant class did in England. That is to say, as the English bourgeoisie, who were neither aristocrats by birth nor poor working-class Englishmen, increased their numbers as a percentage of the population and gained more of an economic and political footing in society throughout the century. We would call them middle class. Tradesmen, salesmen, shopkeepers, clerks, lawyers, teachers, and gentlemen farmers, for example, all shared the aspiration of bettering their lives and their social station through property ownership, arranged marriages, money-making, success in trade, and the like. As their political and social clout grew alongside their increasing wealth, they wanted to be represented in culture. They enjoyed, wrote about, and consumed narratives that were more or less about people like they were, people who were often striving and like to read about plots in which characters too were striving and protagonists beginning life in very humble circumstances and then rising well above those circumstances, enduring pain and suffering along the way, And then those protagonists prevail and become upstanding and respected members of the society. There are a lot of novels you can think about that follow that basic kind of plot line. But there's something more here, too. A growing belief in the dual aspect of life. One part crafted for the social and public sphere, and one felt more intimately in the private recesses of the mind. This belief in an interior life has deep philosophical and religious roots that made the mind the center of thinking and reflection about the nature of the self and its relationship to society. You might think about the philosopher René Descartes' famous phrase, "I think, therefore I am," which is to say it locates the absolute essence of a human being in the mind rather than the body. Exploring the dramatic possibilities of the ways in which the private self comes into conflict with the public persona became a staple of the novel that is still with us today. In fact, when we think of some of the great modernist novels written in the early 20th century, we see a full turn towards the psychological life of characters, a probing of the interior consciousness that expresses itself in the narrative innovations of stream of consciousness, interior monologues, and restricted points of view used and perfected by novelists like Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, William Faulkner, and others. Lastly, I want to mention one other characteristic of the novel, and that is its length. Novels are long texts that are not written to be read in one sitting. Again, this may seem overly general and not uniformly true. For example, I may be able to read the entirety of Kate Chopin's novel The Awakening in one sitting, just as I might read Nella Larsen's novel Passing in one continuous sitting. And that's because both of them are fairly short, but not as short as a typical short story, which I know I can read in one fell swoop. And yet, we call these works novels, just as we do the 600-page Middlemarch or the gigantic Brothers Karamazov and the equally gigantic Don Quixote, all of them novels. You may know already that the majority of novels printed in the 1800s were first serialized in monthly or weekly installments in magazines, so they were not published all at once as very large novels. Chapters of a new ongoing novel, for instance, would appear with each new issue for a whole year or more before they were collected, arranged, and sent to the binderies to be turned into cloth-covered or leather-bound books. Usually the typical novel came out as a book later in 3 volumes. We called these 3-deckers in the Victorian era. These volumes were then distributed to bookshops and circulating libraries for readers to borrow them for a small membership fee, or they were sold by individual subscription by booksellers to those who could afford them. And we have to keep in mind they were very expensive at the time. As you can imagine, this method of producing and consuming novels clearly had an effect on the formal and aesthetic evolution of the genre. Each chapter, appearing in sequence, had more or less to be self-standing. At the same time, it was also a building block in a longer narrative that the reader had to hold in mind. When this system of serialization began to wane in the late 19th century, the aesthetics of the novel changed with it. Novelists began to compose with the larger concept of the narrative structure in mind, rather than composing in pieces that had to be stitched together as they went along. New methods of composition, plotting, character development, and theme all became more possible when the restrictions of serialization were lifted. This is not at all to say that the great novelists of the 19th century were somehow inferior craftsmen to later novelists, but that a big part of their artistic brilliance had to do with the clever ways in which they worked creatively within the publication boundaries that confronted them. We can draw an important inference about a core aspect of the novel by taking a moment to contemplate the experience of reading novels this way over time. This may be hard to do because today many of us have the luxury of streaming or binge watching many episodes of a television series all at once. In the 19th century, though, the comparatively long wait between installments of a new novel meant that certain episodes in the complete work were left to linger in the reader's mind with the passage of time until the next installment became available. Sometimes the writer had to remind the reader of what happened earlier in the novel as the serialization stretched toward its conclusion. These gaps in time left room for speculation in the reader's imagination or created a set of expectations that would either be fulfilled by the next episode or thwarted by it in surprising and delightful ways. Waiting and the passage of time, which are common human experiences in everyday life, were reproduced in the reading experience and made a constitutive part of the form of the novel. If the novel strives to reproduce life as it is actually lived, then simulating the passage of time going by is a key element in producing that illusion. And even though there are obvious differences between the time it takes to read a novel and the way time passes in the narrative of that novel, the sheer commitment the reader makes to time is an investment in that powerful illusion of living through a certain kind of experience or history. At this point, we can summarize at least 4 very general criteria for defining the genre of the novel, keeping in mind, of course, the enormous variations that are also made possible within this literary form. 1. Novels are always texts made of words that are read as text by readers. Novels are written in prose. Novels are fictional, not factual. Novels are long texts that are not written to be read in one sitting. Because our course on the theory of the novel also depends on our knowing something about the origins and history of the form, we want to delve a bit more now into the specific conditions that brought the novel into the shape we now have. There is a difference between how we think of novels today and what was thought of them when they began to emerge in England in the early 18th century. Readers at the time did not exactly know what to call this kind of writing, nor did the early novelists themselves, nor reviewers, nor critics of literature. As you begin to read the assigned materials for this part of the seminar, you will note that authors in the 18th century use a number of different terms interchangeably for the novel, including romance, history, private history, fable, and biography. The growing amount of discussion surrounding this emerging form was in large part the result of working out the formal attributes of the novel, or debate the proper subject matter of novels. Another large difference between our time and theirs has to do with a strong sense that reading novels was a dangerous pastime. In 1800, for example, a 14-year-old English girl named Elizabeth Parker won an essay contest on the subject of whether such a love of novels as excludes all other reading or no reading at all is most to be condemned. Parker argued that no reading at all was better than reading novels. She states her case this way: "The love of novels is, without a doubt, extremely pernicious, as it introduces false ideas into the mind, vitiates the taste, and has a tendency to corrupt the heart." From the very beginning of its appearance within the culture, novels were controversial for just these reasons. In 1692, for example, a short essay appeared in a magazine called the Athenian Mercury that accused readers of romances of softening their minds by, quote, "fooling away so many hours," unquote. It argued that vulgar readers will be given, quote, extravagant ideas of practice and think themselves some king or queen, unquote. 100 years later, Elizabeth Parker would echo this danger when she wrote that female readers of novels will want to, quote, resemble some favorite character, or perhaps to select the principal beauties from several, to unite them in herself, that thus she may resemble a Venus de Medici, end quote. Today, on the other hand, we are accustomed to reading novels not simply for pleasure or flights of the imagination, but as a fundamental source of intellectual development and a means to a higher education. We commonly think of reading novels as an ennobling rather than a denigrating experience. We only have to look at the core curricula of most colleges and universities to see the central role that novels play in this route to knowledge. What accounts for this apparent contradiction goes as far back as the 18th century, because the novel in that time functioned both as a form of literature and a form of popular culture. Often the difference between the two was very hard to determine. Now, as I noted before, abundant written discussion emerged alongside early novels written by people like Samuel Richardson, Henry Fielding, and Daniel Defoe, among many others in the 18th century. The new novel in popular literary culture is therefore not simply defined by itself, but by these debates in which novelists themselves often engaged. These back-and-forth commentaries, responses, charges, and arguments made the novel a participatory form of literature, one whose development was ultimately shaped within and by the critical discourse it generated about itself. This discursive atmosphere blurred the line between the novelist and the critic, and also between the writer and the reader. Where, though, did all this writing of novels and writing about novels take place in the print culture of the time? Where do we find it, and why does it matter? The general answer to this question is to group all such writing under the term paratextual, which is to say all the textual spaces that closely surround and are explicitly about the text of the novel per se, but that are not specifically or necessarily part of the novel itself. We are talking about, therefore, magazine columns devoted to literary criticism and book reviews, essays, commentaries, lectures, sermons, and most importantly of all, the various prefaces and dedications, introductions, or opening remarks written by the novelists themselves, and often printed on the first pages of their newly published novels. These authorial prefaces are a rich source of information for us because in them we can see the novel working out its own formal problems, its own guidelines concerning subject matter, characters, style, purpose, and themes. To get a sense of the newness of the novel form in the 18th century, and what it's like when new and evolving kinds of written communication, art, or literature first emerge in a culture, we can use a modern-day analogy to our own experience of internet communication. Especially during this time of lockdowns and stay-at-home orders, our online activity has been accelerated and deepened considerably, and it is adapting rapidly to our changing circumstances. Since the turn of the 21st century, we have found ourselves embedded in the origins and evolution of new cultural forms such as chat rooms, texting, social media postings, blogging, vlogging, podcasts, and TikTok videos. All of these are changing the way we communicate with each other, but they are also shaping an as yet undefined literary or online culture that is similar to what happened with the technologies and print mediums that gave rise to the early novel in England and America and in other places throughout the world. Like the novel, new kinds of writing are emerging on the internet all the time, new forms of text leading to new ways of thinking and ideas. Reading and writing have the power to reshape
a culture, and those two activities depend upon new technologies to make this possible, whether that means a physical book in the hand or a screen that you scroll through.
The invention of the novel in the 18th century parallels the invention of a new kind of writing that we would now call literary criticism. The debates about novels had to do with several persistent issues: how to define the form, how to determine its social influence and what to do about that, questions of the aesthetic or artistic qualities of novels and how to judge their artistic merit, and what counted as a narrative structure. In other words, how should the stories novels tell be told, and by whom? To be more specific about this, questions raised about novels usually included the following kinds of things. In attempting to define the novel, how does it fit into the classical categories of literature such as tragedy or comedy? How can a novel create a unified plot instead of just compiling a random assortment of incidents? What is the purpose of a novel? Pure entertainment, moral instruction, or a combination of both of these things? Can a novel tell truths that other kinds of writing cannot? Where did the novel come from, and what is its true history? Does it derive from the epic plots of Homer or Virgil? Should its form adhere to the structural elements of unity laid out by Aristotle's Poetics? Today, some of the basic qualities and formal conventions of the novel have become familiar to us through the terminology of critics and scholars. For instance, we have a more sophisticated understanding of narrative elements such as plot, character development, causation, point of view, techniques of representing the passage of time and the spatial dimension of fictional worlds, and even some elaborate ways of representing in fiction the interior consciousness and unconscious motivations of characters. None of these descriptive categories existed in the 18th century. In fact, novelists themselves had not reached that particular level of artistic or narrative development. Studying the origins of the novel in the 18th century means putting aside for now what
modern scholarship has taught us to think. We are returning to a time when the novel's rules did not exist, and critical debate was only just beginning to shape readers' expectations.
One of the dominant traits of the novel from its very beginnings is its commitment to reproduce life as it is actually lived. This is a very broad working definition with a lot of exceptions. It is also the case that when we speak of literary realism, we're speaking more about a specific kind of aesthetic approach to rendering reality. We'll certainly talk more about this as we go along. But for now, I want to point out that in the 18th century, novelists and their critics agreed that the goal of novels was to imitate reality. But what they meant by that was simply that the plots and situations of the characters in a novel were to be judged realistic only if they met a certain threshold of probability and possibility. The question of realism goes deeper than this when we consider how close in meaning are the words reality and truth. How, for example, can a novel maintain truth within the falsity of fiction? This was a persistent concern, especially for novelists and commentators who worried about the moral and psychological impact novels might have on impressionable readers. There's a reason for this, as you will see in the prefaces that I assigned to you, that the authors themselves tend to complicate or try to explain with regard to the relationship between fiction and truth in order to justify their work. Historians and theorists of the novel have made the consequences of this confusion between truth and fiction the basis of their inquiries, which you will see well expressed in Catherine Gallagher's essay on fictionality. On the other hand, when we think in non-academic terms about the word romance, we tend to align it with a love story or a courtship plot. From the perspective of literary history, however, the romance can be traced back to its medieval roots, where it was associated with heroic adventure stories in addition to courtly love. Generally speaking, the romance features challenging quests undertaken by larger-than-life figures such as brave knights, and includes fantastical elements such as giants and exotic settings such as castles placed in the remote past. The unrealistic qualities of the romance are typically emphasized as a way of differentiating it from the realistic novel. In fact, it's quite common to use the term novel and realism as if they were always one and the same thing. On the other hand, the novel differs from the romance in that it provides a picture of real life and manners and of the times in which it was written. Romances are usually written in a high, lofty language, describing what never happened nor is likely to happen in real life. The 18th century novelist Clara Reeve explained that the novel gives a familiar relation of such things as pass every day before our eyes, such as may happen to our friend or to ourselves. In a review of Jane Austen's novel, Emma, which we will be reading, Sir Walter Scott praised the book's realism for finding such spirit and originality within common incidents that the reader never misses the excitation of uncommon events that are found in the romance. Some contemporary critics see a revival of romance in Gothic fiction, with its supernatural stories of castles and ghosts, as well as in the novel of sensibility, with its emphasis on excessive emotional displays. It's worth noting that in many of her realistic novels, Jane Austen herself parodies these romantic literary forms. The prime example, of course, being her satirical novel called Northanger Abbey. Given what I said earlier about the universality of the novel form, and the many streams of influence that went into its making, it might strike some of you as a little idiosyncratic to locate the origins of the novel in a highly specific place and time, such as 18th century England. It might be more accurate to say that a certain form of the novel developed there at that time, and then that form prevailed and came to dominate what we've come to think about this genre over the last 300 years or so. In the late 1950s, Ian Watt wrote a book that solidified this understanding of the literary history of the novel, and he suggestively titled it The Rise of the Novel, Studies in Richardson, Fielding, and Defoe. More recently, theorists of the novel that I've mentioned, like Guido Mazzoni, take a much more international, cross-cultural, multilingual, and more deeply historical approach to understanding the emergence of the genre. But for the most part, Watt's work remains valuable. What was it, though, that Watt saw in 18th century England that accounted for this particular literary form at this particular time? Well, Watt understood the rise of the novel as not just the rise of a literary form, but as the product and the expression of a social phenomenon as well. He connected the rise of the novel with the development of new social activities, like people reading and discussing books together, and the development of new conceptual ideas, like individualism. Watt focused on male writers, to the exclusion of a large body of work produced by women at the time. This has since been corrected by a number of feminist scholars. His main thesis, though, which is still widely accepted, is that the novel was made possible by three simultaneous developments the rise of the middle class, which led to a rise in literacy and the availability of more leisure time to read. These were the conditions that made the novel a viable form of literature. One of Watts' most enduring claims about the novel has to do with its connection to the economic individualism gained by middle-class Englishmen, which he defines as a concept that, quote, posits a whole society mainly governed by the idea of every individual's intrinsic independence from both other individuals and from that multifarious allegiance to past modes of thought and action denoted by the word tradition, end quote. In other words, he's talking about a strong anti-traditionalist sentiment within the middle class that allowed for the rise of a popular form like the novel. According to Watt, and I'm quoting here, such a society depends on an economic and political organization which allows its members a wide range of choices, end quote, or, in other words, on a capitalist social structure that prioritizes economic self-determination. The value of Watt's approach for us has to do with the way he makes us think in fresh ways about literature's relationship to society and material reality. Although Watt's thesis about the middle-class origins of the novel has been contested, many later critics still use it as a springboard for more detailed studies. For instance, current scholarship has focused not just on the economic and social conditions of 18th century England, but on the more general rise of print culture itself, which encompasses things like writing, publishing, selling, and lending or reading the printed text. Significant changes occurred in the publishing business, starting with the lapse in the Printing Act of 1695, which allowed printing to expand by removing licensing barriers and creating an environment in which printers had a better chance to succeed financially. In 1814, the invention of steam mechanized printing signaled the start of a new period of truly mass publication. Given these and other developments, the novel can be understood as emerging from a rich print culture that included literary criticism. In fact, the development of a popular literary criticism in the 18th century, not the kind of esoteric literary criticism we think of today, but a more everyday kind of chatty but intelligent talk about books and other forms of writing. In the 18th century, this kind of writing, rather than the novel, came first and prevailed. The number of copies of novels printed was actually fairly small. A typical print run was typically 500 to 750 copies, with new editions of popular titles enjoying print runs of 1,000 to 1,500 copies. Many older fiction titles were printed as well, so that altogether large amounts of novelistic writing were in circulation at any given time, even if the numbers of new novels seem to suggest otherwise. The increase in the circulation of novels at the time was matched by the increase in the circulation of periodicals in the 18th century, many of which contained commentary on those novels. More than 30 different non-newspaper magazine-like periodicals, for example, were in existence by 1745, which was just 3 years after the publication of Henry Fielding's enormously successful novel Joseph Andrews, which came out in 1742. By 1750, this number reached 50, and by 1765, it was more than 75. Periodicals were also printed in far greater numbers than were novels. The London Magazine, the Gentleman's Magazine, the Critical Review, and the Monthly Review, just to name a few, for example, could sell as many as 10,000 copies and boast circulations as high as 28,000. The commentary these periodicals provided about the novel play a particularly important role as important indicators of literary culture for both good and bad. Within this fairly steady, ongoing discourse of novels and commentaries about novels that was produced throughout the 18th century, there were occasional and significant explosions of debate that created what we might call media events. These events stimulated discussions about the novel in ways that posed important and consequential questions about its future development. One such event was triggered in 1740 with the publication of a novel by Samuel Richardson called Pamela, the plot of which I briefly summarized earlier in this lecture. The book created a flurry of anti-Pamela writing, including Henry Fielding's book Shamala, Eliza Haywood's Anti-Pamela, and the anonymous book Pamela Censured, all published in 1741. In that same year, John Kelly wrote an unofficial sequel to the novel called Pamela's Conduct in High Life. This event reveals how popular literary criticism fed upon itself, and it shows how 18th century novel reading was a media-saturated and media-heightened experience. The prefaces and commentaries I have asked you to read in connection with this lecture capture some of that experience, in addition to revealing the kinds of formal and thematic concerns that went into the composition of early novels. Even though the novel was still largely in its embryonic form in the first half of the 18th century, it is important to consider how early criticism of the form became incorporated into the art of the novel. The novel does not just develop alongside its criticism, but it also understands itself through that criticism and internalizes the findings of that criticism. This occurs in part because novel writers are also engaged in writing that criticism, providing us with a clear record of what they were thinking about as they invented this new literary form. You will see this again, incidentally, in more modern authors like Henry James, who wrote a series of prefaces for all of his major novels after he revised them in the early 1900s for a new collected edition in the later part of his career. This is why prefaces provide the most important source of commentary about the novel. To give some examples from the 18th century, Henry Fielding wrestles with the definition of the novel in his preface to Joseph Andrews and incorporates literary criticism as well as attacks on literary critics in the chapters that open each book of his later novel, Tom Jones. Samuel Richardson's Pamela and Clarissa includes letters that Richardson wrote and reprinted, mimicking the epistolary form and creating a space of exchange between the author and the reader. Now, with regard to actual reading practices, one study of the novel suggests that one published copy of a book was read by an average of 4 people in the 18th century, a fact that is attributable to the institutionalization of the circulating library. Booksellers ran these for-profit libraries that allowed fee-paying members to borrow rather than purchase books at their full price. By the year 1800 in England, there were 665 circulating libraries in operation throughout the country. This kind of historical data helps scholars of the novel to contextualize its origins with reference not only to the costs of printing materials, rates of literacy in the general population, but also to people's reading practices, trends in the consumption of literature, new forms of marketing, and other related matters. You get a good sense of the rise of literacy in England when you look at the research statistics that scholars like Vivian Jones has compiled. In the year 1640, for example, only 10% of women and 33% of men could sign their names. which is the traditional indicator of literacy. By 1700, these figures had risen to 30% women and 50% of men, and by 1760, this is only 60 years later, the figures had risen again to 40% of women and 60% of men, at which levels they remained until the end of the century, and at that point they shoot up quite dramatically once again.